She thought it was just a desperate lie to save her pride, but she was about to step into a power she couldn't even imagine. The glass slipped from Ava Johnson's trembling hand and shattered against the polished hardwood floor, the sharp crack cutting through the low hum of the bar like a warning no one else seemed to hear, but she did, because her eyes were locked on the reflection behind the bottles, on the man she had spent 2 years trying to forget, now leaning against the counter with that same careless smirk, surrounded by laughter that wasn't kind. Laughter that was waiting for her to fall apart, and for a second, she almost did, her chest tightening, her breath catching, the weight of every insult he ever threw at her pressing down all at once, until she turned, searching for an escape that didn't exist, and found him instead, sitting alone just 2 stools away, calm, composed, untouched by the noise, his white shirt crisp under the dim amber lights, his presence quiet but somehow immovable, like the room had shaped itself around him without permission, and before logic could stop her, before pride could pull her back. Ava stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper, fragile but urgent, "Please, just kiss me, he's watching," and for a moment, time hesitated, the kind of pause that stretches longer than it should, where choices begin to matter more than reasons, and the man looked at her, really looked at her, not past her like the others, not through her like she didn't belong, but at her, as if measuring something deeper than the words she had just spoken, his dark eyes unreadable. Steady, and then the noise of the bar crept back in, her ex's voice louder now, closer, mocking, "Ava, you really think anyone here would pick you?" The laughter followed, sharp and deliberate, and she felt it land, every word, every stare, the kind that strips dignity piece by piece, and still she didn't move, because she had already chosen, already stepped too far to turn back, and that was when the man beside her stood, smooth, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world, like none of this was rushed, none of it accidental, and without a word, without asking her name or her story, he closed the distance between them, one hand steady at her waist, not possessive, not careless, just certain, and he leaned in, pressing a quiet, deliberate kiss against her lips, not long, not exaggerated, but enough to shift the air in the room, enough to silence the laughter mid-breath, enough to make every eye turn, and when he pulled back, he didn't let go, his gaze lifting past her shoulder, landing exactly where her ex stood, and the smirk that had lived so comfortably on that man's face faltered for the first time, confusion replacing confidence, because something had changed, something he didn't understand yet, and neither did Ava, not fully, not until she noticed the subtle movement near the entrance, 2 men in dark suits stepping into place, not loudly, not aggressively, just there, watching, waiting, as if they had always been part of the night, as if they belonged to the man still standing beside her, and suddenly the bar didn't feel the same, the laughter didn't sound the same, and the man she had kissed didn't feel like a stranger anymore. Ava did not realize she was still holding her breath until he stepped back just enough for her to see his face clearly, and for the first time since she walked into that bar, the noise around her faded into something distant, like a storm heard through thick glass, because the man standing in front of her was not reacting the way anyone else would have. There was no smug satisfaction, no expectation, no question about what she owed him for what he had just done, only a quiet stillness that made her feel seen in a way she had not prepared for, and it unsettled her more than the humiliation ever could, while across the room her ex shifted his weight, the easy confidence draining from his posture as his eyes flicked toward the entrance where those 2 men in dark suits now stood with a kind of patience that did not belong to ordinary customers, and suddenly the laughter that once circled him began to thin, conversations lowering, glances redirecting, because something in the air had changed, something no one could name but everyone could feel, and Ava instinctively stepped back, her voice catching as she whispered, "I am sorry, I just needed," but the man gently shook his head, not dismissing her, not correcting her, simply acknowledging the moment as if it had already been understood. "You do not owe me an explanation," he said, his tone even, controlled, carrying just enough weight to quiet the panic rising in her chest, and that was when her ex took a step forward, slower now, cautious in a way Ava had never seen before. "Who do you think you are?" he asked, forcing a laugh that did not quite land, trying to reclaim a stage that no longer belonged to him, but the man beside Ava did not respond immediately, he did not raise his voice or step forward, he only turned his head slightly, his gaze settling on him with a calm that felt far more powerful than anger, and in that silence, something invisible shifted again, because dominance was no longer about volume, it was about presence. And the room leaned toward it without permission. Ava felt it in the way the bartender stopped polishing the same glass, in the way a couple at the far table turned their chairs just enough to watch, in the way her own heartbeat slowed despite everything that had just happened, and when the man finally spoke, it was not to challenge, not to threaten, but to ask, "Is this how you treat someone you once cared about?" The question landed heavier than any insult, simple and direct, stripping away performance and leaving only truth, and her ex hesitated, just for a second. But it was enough for everyone to see the crack in his confidence, enough for the illusion he had built to falter, and Ava felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest, not fear, not shame, but something steadier, something that had been buried under years of being talked over and looked past, and as she stood there, still close enough to feel the quiet strength of the man beside her, she realized the moment was no longer about pretending, no longer about escaping embarrassment. It had become something else entirely, something that was rewriting the way the room saw her, and more importantly, the way she saw herself, even if she did not yet understand why this stranger had chosen to stand beside her, or why the rest of the room had suddenly decided to stand still. The silence that followed did not break all at once, it stretched, thin and fragile, as if the entire room was waiting for someone to decide what came next. And for the first time that night, Ava realized it was not her who felt small anymore, because the man standing across from her no longer looked like someone in control, his eyes flickering between her and the stranger beside her, trying to measure something he could not quite understand, trying to regain footing in a space that had quietly shifted beneath him, and when he spoke again, his voice carried less certainty, more edge than confidence. "You think this changes anything?" he said, forcing a smirk that did not quite reach his eyes, but Ava did not answer, not this time, because she felt the presence next to her steady and unwavering, like a wall that did not need to move to hold its ground, and the man beside her finally stepped forward, not aggressively, not rushing, just enough to close the distance in a way that made the air between them feel intentional, controlled, and when he spoke, it was softer than anyone expected, but it carried further than any raised voice could have. "It already has," he said, his gaze never leaving the other man, and something about the way he said it made the truth undeniable, not just for the one being addressed, but for everyone watching, because the shift was no longer subtle, it was visible in the way the laughter had disappeared completely, in the way no one reached for their phones anymore, in the way the bartender now stood still instead of pretending not to listen, and Ava felt it too, not just around her, but inside her, something settling into place, something she had not felt in a long time, a quiet sense of worth that did not need to be defended out loud, and for a moment, she almost forgot why she had asked for help in the first place, until her ex let out a short, frustrated laugh and took another step forward, but this time he stopped halfway, as if something unseen had drawn a line he did not dare cross, his eyes flicking once more toward the entrance, toward the men who had not moved but somehow seemed closer now, more present, and it was in that hesitation that the truth finally began to form, not spoken, not confirmed, but understood in the subtle language of power, the kind that does not announce itself but is recognized instantly by those who know how to read it, and Ava saw it happen in real time, the exact moment confidence turned into caution, when pride gave way to instinct, and the man who once made her feel invisible now struggled to hold his ground under a gaze that never raised its voice, and still the stranger beside her did not escalate, did not threaten, he simply remained, his posture relaxed, his expression calm, as if everything unfolding had already been decided long before anyone else noticed, and then, almost as an afterthought, he turned slightly toward Ava, his voice lowering just enough for only her to hear, "Are you all right?" And the question caught her off guard more than anything else that night, because it was not about proving a point, it was not about winning, it was about her, and for a second she did not know how to answer, her throat tightening, her thoughts scattered between the past she had been trying to survive and the present that suddenly felt different, safer in a way she did not yet trust, and all she managed was a small nod, barely noticeable, but he saw it, of course he did, and something in his expression softened, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to feel it, a shift that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with choice, and in that quiet exchange, Ava began to understand that whatever this man was, whatever world he came from, his presence in this moment was not accidental, and the way he stood beside her was not part of an act anymore, it was something real, something deliberate, and the room, still holding its breath, seemed to recognize it too. The moment lingered just a second too long, and in that second, everything finally broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet shift that no one could undo, because her ex took a step back, just one, but it was enough for everyone to see that whatever control he thought he had over this situation was gone, and he tried to recover it with a shrug, a forced laugh that landed flat in the heavy air. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, glancing around as if looking for support that was no longer there, but no one stepped in, no one laughed with him this time, and that silence said more than anything else could, because it was no longer Ava standing alone in front of judgment, it was him. And for the first time since she had known him, he did not look like the center of the room, he looked like someone who had overstayed his moment, and the realization hit him slowly, visibly, until he finally turned, shaking his head as if dismissing something he could not control, and walked away without another word, his presence fading into the background he once dominated, and the shift was complete, the tension in the room releasing all at once like a breath finally exhaled, conversations returning in low murmurs, glasses clinking again, but softer now, more careful, as if the space itself had been reset, and Ava stood there, still, trying to process how quickly everything had changed, how the weight she carried just minutes ago had lifted without her having to fight for it, without her having to prove anything, and she slowly turned toward the man beside her, her voice quiet but steadier now. "I did not expect that," she admitted, and he gave the smallest hint of a nod. As if the outcome had never been in doubt, people reveal themselves when they think no one is watching, he said, his tone calm, measured, as though he was speaking from experience rather than observation, and something about the way he said it made Ava wonder how much he had seen, how many moments like this he had witnessed, or perhaps caused, but before she could ask, the manager approached, his posture noticeably more respectful than it had been earlier in the night, his smile careful, almost rehearsed. "Sir, we would be honored to move you to a more private table," he said, glancing briefly at Ava before returning his attention to the man, and it was in that moment, in that small, almost insignificant exchange, that Ava felt the truth settle into place, because this was not just a regular customer being offered better service, this was recognition, the kind that came from knowing exactly who someone was without needing to say it out loud, and the man paused for a fraction of a second before responding, his eyes flicking toward Ava, considering, measuring, not her worth, but her comfort, and then he said simply, "No, this is fine," and the manager nodded immediately, stepping back without question, without hesitation, as if that answer carried more authority than any request ever could, and Ava felt it again, that quiet, undeniable presence that had shifted everything around her, and she realized she was standing next to someone who did not need to raise his voice to be heard, someone who did not need to prove anything to be respected, and yet, despite all of that, he remained there, beside her, not above her, not distant, just present, and for the first time that night, Ava allowed herself to breathe fully, her shoulders relaxing as the reality settled in, not just that she had been defended, but that she had been seen, and as she met his gaze again, she knew the question forming in her mind could no longer be ignored, not about what had just happened, but about who he really was, because whatever answer she was about to find, she could already feel it would change everything that came next. Ava hesitated before speaking, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the bar as if grounding herself in something familiar, because everything else about this moment felt unfamiliar, unreal in a way she could not quite explain, and when she finally looked at him again, really looked this time, she noticed details she had missed before, the precision in the way he carried himself, the quiet awareness in his eyes that seemed to register everything without reacting, the kind of composure that did not come from confidence alone but from control, and her voice came out softer than she intended, "Who are you?" And the question hung between them, simple, direct, but heavier than it sounded, because it was not just curiosity, it was realization, the understanding that she had stepped into something far beyond a spontaneous moment, and he held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, as if deciding how much truth belonged in this space, how much she needed to know, and instead of answering directly, he asked, "Does it matter?" his tone calm, not dismissive, but measured, and Ava felt the answer rise instinctively. "It does if I am supposed to pretend I know you," she said, her voice steadier now, no longer hiding behind urgency. And something shifted in his expression, subtle but real, like he had not expected that response. Like he had expected gratitude or distance, but not honesty, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something human behind the control, something that almost resembled respect, and he exhaled slowly before saying, "Ethan, just a name, nothing more," but the way he said it carried weight, not in the word itself, but in everything it left unsaid, and Ava repeated it quietly, as if testing it, "Ethan," and the name settled into the moment with an ease that felt unexpected, and yet, even with that small piece of truth, the space between them still held questions, still held the quiet awareness that this was not an ordinary introduction, and before she could press further, one of the men near the entrance stepped closer, not interrupting, not intruding, but present enough to be noticed, leaning in just enough to murmur something low, something meant only for Ethan, and Ava caught the shift immediately. The way his posture adjusted, the way his attention narrowed for just a second before returning to her, and whatever had been said, it mattered, not urgently, not in a way that demanded immediate action, but in a way that confirmed what she had already begun to understand, that his world did not stop for moments like this, that his presence here was not accidental, and that realization should have made her step back, should have reminded her to keep her distance, but instead, it made her more aware of the fact that he had chosen to stay, chosen not to leave when he easily could have, and that choice lingered between them, unspoken but undeniable, and as the room slowly returned to its rhythm, Ava found herself standing a little straighter, not because she needed to impress anyone, but because something inside her had shifted, something that no longer allowed her to shrink under the weight of someone else's judgment, and Ethan noticed it, of course he did, the slight change in her posture, the steadiness in her gaze, and he nodded almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging something she had not yet put into words, and in that quiet exchange, Ava realized that whatever had started as a desperate attempt to protect her dignity had turned into something else entirely, something that was no longer about pretending, but about being seen for who she really was, and for reasons she could not explain, she felt that this man, this stranger named Ethan, understood that better than anyone else in the room. Ava should have walked away, that thought came to her more than once as she stood there beside him, as the rhythm of the bar slowly returned to something normal, but nothing about this moment felt normal anymore, not the way people glanced in their direction with quiet curiosity, not the way the staff moved with a new kind of awareness, and certainly not the way Ethan remained completely unaffected by it all, as if attention had never meant anything to him in the first place, and that difference unsettled her more than she expected, because she had spent so long measuring herself through the reactions of others that seeing someone exist outside of that made her question everything she thought she understood about power and presence, and she found herself speaking again before she could stop herself. "You do not act like anyone else here," her tone thoughtful now rather than nervous, and Ethan's expression shifted slightly. Not defensive, not proud, just acknowledging the observation as if it were obvious. "Most people act for the room," he replied calmly, his gaze briefly scanning the space before returning to her. "I do not," and the simplicity of that answer carried more meaning than any explanation could have, because it was not about arrogance, it was about certainty, the kind that did not need validation, and Ava felt something stir in her chest at that, something that felt both unfamiliar and quietly inspiring, as if she were seeing a version of strength she had never considered before, and before she could respond, the bartender approached, setting down a fresh glass of water in front of her without being asked, his usual casual demeanor replaced by something more respectful, almost careful, and Ava noticed it immediately, the subtle change in how she was being treated, not because she had done anything differently, but because of who she was standing next to, and that realization should have made her uncomfortable, should have reminded her that this respect was conditional, borrowed, but instead, it made her think about how easily perception could shift, how quickly people decided someone's worth based on what they saw rather than who they were, and she looked at Ethan again, studying him more openly now. "Is that why people listen to you?" she asked quietly, and he held her gaze for a moment before answering. "People listen when they understand the cost of not listening," his voice still calm, still controlled, but there was something beneath it now, something deeper, something that hinted at a world far more complex than this bar, and Ava felt the weight of that answer settle over her, not as fear, but as understanding, because whatever his life was, whatever responsibilities followed him even into a place like this, they were real, they mattered, and yet, he was still here, still choosing to stand beside her in a moment that had nothing to do with his world, and that choice felt significant in a way she could not fully explain, and for a second, neither of them spoke, the space between them quiet but not empty, filled with unspoken questions and unacknowledged truths, until Ava finally exhaled, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as she admitted, "I asked you to help me because I thought I had no other option," her voice steady now, grounded in something more honest than desperation, "but I think I needed to see this," and Ethan watched her closely, not interrupting, not correcting, just listening in a way that made her feel like her words mattered, and when she finished, he gave a small nod, not as approval, but as recognition, as if he understood exactly what she meant. Without needing further explanation, and in that quiet moment, Ava realized that whatever happened next, whatever answers she would eventually uncover about him, this was the point where everything had already begun to change, not just around her, but within her, and there was no going back to who she had been before she walked into this night. The music resumed its steady rhythm, but for Ava, the night no longer felt like something she was simply working through, it felt like something she was standing inside of, something unfolding with a quiet inevitability she could not explain, and as she reached for the glass of water placed in front of her, her hands no longer trembled the way they had earlier, the nervous energy replaced by a strange clarity that made everything around her appear sharper, more defined, and she realized it was not just the room that had changed, it was her, the way she stood, the way she looked at people, the way she no longer felt the need to shrink under the weight of someone else's opinion, and when she glanced at Ethan again, she found him already watching her, not intensely, not intrusively, but with a quiet awareness that made her feel understood in a way that was both comforting and unsettling at the same time. And before she could look away, he spoke, his voice low enough to stay between them. "You are not the same person you were when you walked up to me," and the statement was not a question, not an assumption, it was an observation, and Ava felt something in her chest tighten slightly at the truth of it, because he was right, even if she could not fully articulate why. "I do not think I can be," she admitted softly, her eyes dropping briefly before returning to meet his, steadier now, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, the silence stretching in a way that felt natural rather than uncomfortable, until the door of the bar opened again, letting in a brief rush of cool night air that brushed against Ava's skin, and with it came a shift she could not ignore, the subtle straightening of the men near the entrance, the quick glance exchanged between them, and the way Ethan's attention flickered toward the door before returning to her, more focused now, more deliberate, as if time had quietly begun to run out on whatever space this moment occupied, and Ava noticed it immediately, the difference in the air, the unspoken signal that something beyond her understanding was beginning to call him back, and she found herself asking, not out of fear, but out of curiosity, "You have somewhere you need to be, do not you?" And Ethan held her gaze for a second longer than necessary before answering, "There is always somewhere I need to be," his tone unchanged, but the meaning behind it clearer now, and Ava nodded slowly, accepting that answer even if it did not explain everything, because she was beginning to understand that his world operated on a different set of rules, ones that did not require explanation to exist, and yet, despite that, he had stayed, he had chosen to remain in a moment that had nothing to do with obligation. And that realization stayed with her as she set her glass down, her voice quieter now but filled with something more certain than before. "Then why are you still here?" And the question lingered between them, simple on the surface but layered with everything she had not said, everything she had begun to feel but did not yet understand, and for the first time since she had met him, Ethan did not answer immediately, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable, as if the question itself required consideration, not because it was difficult, but because it mattered, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, carrying a weight that did not need emphasis, "Because I wanted to be," and the honesty of that answer settled into the space between them, quiet but undeniable, and Ava felt it, not as a grand gesture, not as something overwhelming, but as something real, something grounded in choice rather than circumstance, and in that moment, she realized that whatever came next, whatever direction this night would take, it was no longer defined by desperation or escape, it was defined by something far more powerful, the simple, deliberate act of someone choosing to stay. The answer lingered between them, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and Ava felt something shift again, deeper this time, something that had nothing to do with the room or the people in it, but everything to do with the quiet understanding forming between her and the man beside her, because choice, real choice, was not something she had seen often in her life, not from others, and not even from herself, and yet here it was, simple and undeniable. And before she could respond, the man who had spoken to Ethan earlier stepped closer again, this time with a little more urgency, his voice still low but firmer. "We cannot delay any longer," he said, careful with his tone, respectful but clear, and Ava saw it instantly, the shift in Ethan's posture, not dramatic, not tense, but focused, like someone returning to a role they never truly left, and for a brief moment, the space they had been standing in felt smaller, more fragile, as if whatever had been holding this moment together was beginning to give way to something larger, something that belonged to his world, not hers, and she did not fully understand that world, but she understood enough to know it was real, and that it was calling him back now, and Ethan turned slightly toward the man, giving a small nod that carried more authority than any command, and the man stepped back immediately, as if that single acknowledgement was all he needed, and then Ethan looked at Ava again, his gaze steady, but different now, not distant, not cold, just aware that the moment they had shared was reaching its natural end, and Ava felt it too, the quiet realization settling in, not as disappointment, but as acceptance, because something important had already happened, something that could not be undone or ignored, and she found herself speaking before the silence could stretch too far, her voice calm but honest. "I guess this is where your world pulls you back," and there was no accusation in her tone, no expectation, just a simple recognition of what was unfolding, and Ethan studied her for a second, as if weighing something unspoken, before replying, "It does," and then, after a brief pause, he added, "But that does not mean this did not matter," and those words settled into her more deeply than she expected, because they acknowledged something she had not yet put into words herself, that this was not just a passing moment, not just a temporary escape, it was something real, something that had changed her in a way she could already feel but not fully explain, and she nodded slowly, accepting that truth, and as she did, she noticed the men near the entrance beginning to move more deliberately now, preparing, waiting, not impatient, but ready, and the room seemed to sense it too, the subtle shift in attention, the quiet awareness that something significant was about to leave as quietly as it had arrived, and Ava took a small step back, not because she felt pushed away, but because she understood that his presence here had never been ordinary, and that stepping away now was not losing something, it was respecting it, and Ethan noticed the movement, of course he did. And for a brief second, something softened in his expression again, something almost unguarded, before it settled back into the composure that defined him, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out a simple card, placing it gently on the bar in front of her without making it a spectacle, without drawing attention. "If you ever find yourself needing something more than a moment," he said quietly, his voice meant only for her, "you will know how to reach me," and Ava looked down at the card, then back up at him, understanding that whatever name or number it held, it was more than just contact, it was a door into a world she had only just glimpsed, and for a second, she wondered what it would mean to step through it, what it would cost, what it would change, and before she could ask, before she could decide, Ethan gave her one last look, not long, not dramatic, just enough to make sure she understood that this moment, this connection, had been real, and then he turned, moving toward the door with the same quiet authority he had carried all night, the men falling into place around him without a word, without hesitation, and as he stepped out into the night, the door closing softly behind him, the room seemed to exhale once more, returning to itself, but Ava remained where she was, her eyes still on the space he had just left, the card resting in front of her, and the realization settling in that this night had not ended, it had only begun to reveal what was possible. For a long moment, Ava did not move, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the card as if it might disappear if she let go too soon, the noise of the bar slowly returning to its usual rhythm around her, but it felt distant now, like something she was no longer fully part of, because the space he had occupied still lingered, not physically, but in the way the air felt heavier, quieter, more aware. And she realized that nothing about this night had been ordinary, not the humiliation, not the sudden shift, and certainly not the man who had walked in like he belonged to a different reality and left just as quietly, taking that gravity with him, and she exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing as she picked up the card, turning it over in her hand, simple, understated, no unnecessary details, just a name and a number, and even that felt intentional, like everything else about him, and for a second, she considered what it meant, not just to have it, but to use it, to step into whatever world existed behind that name, and the thought was not frightening the way it should have been, it was steady, grounded, because for the first time in a long time, she did not feel like she was being pulled by desperation, she felt like she had a choice, and that difference mattered more than anything else, and as she stood there, the bartender approached again, his tone softer now, almost respectful in a way that had not been there before. "You all right?" he asked, and Ava met his eyes, really met them this time, not shrinking, not deflecting, just present, and she nodded, "Yeah, I am," her voice calm, certain, and she realized she meant it, not because everything was perfect, but because something inside her had shifted into place, something that would not easily be undone, and she set the card down for a moment, glancing around the room, noticing how people looked at her differently now, not with pity, not with judgment, but with curiosity. Even a hint of respect, and she understood that part of it came from who she had been standing next to, but another part came from how she had chosen to stand, and that realization stayed with her as she picked the card up again, sliding it carefully into the pocket of her apron, not as a promise, not as a decision, but as a possibility, and the night continued, orders to take, tables to clear, the routine returning in pieces. But nothing felt the same, because every step she took now carried a quiet awareness she had not had before, every glance she met held a little more weight, and every word she spoke felt a little more grounded, and somewhere outside, beyond the glass doors and the dim lights, a world existed that she had only glimpsed for a few minutes, a world where power did not need to be loud to be absolute, where presence alone could shift everything in a room, and she had stood inside that world, even if only briefly. And as the hours passed and the crowd slowly thinned, Ava found herself replaying the moment over and over, not the kiss, not the confrontation, but the choice, the simple, deliberate choice of someone who had no reason to stay, and yet did, and in that quiet understanding, she realized that dignity was not something given by others, it was something recognized, something claimed, something held even when the world tried to take it away, and as she wiped down the counter one last time, the reflection staring back at her no longer looked uncertain or small, it looked steady. Aware, and for the first time, she did not look away, because she knew exactly who she was, and she knew that whatever came next, whatever choices she would make, they would no longer come from fear, and that night, without anyone announcing it, without any grand moment to mark it, the world had shifted just enough for her to see it clearly, and in that quiet, almost invisible change, everything had already begun.